Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Ken Berlin. I'm a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, where I run a program called Financing and Achieving Cost-Competitive Climate Solutions. We're here today to discuss the World Trade System. And the reason is that the World Trade System is at a crossroads. People have been questioning whether the mandate of the World Trade System, of the trading system as of today, is too narrow, and whether it's addressed the issues, all the issues that need to be addressed in the modern world. And the conclusion has been that the system has not addressed critical issues. It has ignored, or largely ignored, issues like climate change, the environment, pollution, biodiversity, agricultural issues, agricultural sustainability, forest sustainability. In general, it has not really carried out its mandate to ensure that the trade system is a sustainable system. The result is a series of studies have been done, and they've reached the conclusion, as I said, that the system has not really succeeded in reaching its mandate. Those conclusions are embodied in a document called the Villars Framework for a Sustainable Trade System, which we have copies of on the seats there if you'd like to take a look at it. The Villars Framework proposes a very ambitious series of reforms to the system. And if those reforms are implemented, I think they would have a profound impact on climate change, among other issues. We're very fortunate today to have a panel that can discuss this issue in great detail. I'm going to introduce each panelist separately when it's their turn to speak, but I want to start off with Genevieve Remy. She is director of the Ramphal Center for International Trade at the University of West Indies. He's got an extremely distinguished biography, and with everybody, I'm not going to give their full biography, but the key point is she is one of the key authors of the Villars Framework. And let me turn it over to her to really describe the framework and what they were trying to accomplish.
Thank you so much to you and the Atlantic Council for having us here, and welcome to all of you who made it to this session and those of you who are joining us online. So if I do my job really well in the next 5 minutes, you're going to be scurrying either to our website called the remakingtradeproject.org, or those of you in the room, you're going to run to the seats here where we actually have a copy of the Villars Framework, which represents a summary of about 164 pages of detailed exposition of our thinking on how the trade system writ large, the WTO is the sort of the poster child for the trade system, the World Trade Organization, or more regionally, how any of these systems that really are about trade relations between countries can actually move the green transition forward. So I'm Genevieve Remy, as I was introduced, and I'm sitting next to Dan Esty, professor at the Yale Environment Center, and along with Joel Trackman at the Tufts University, also a professor, and one of my colleagues who's a research director at the Remaking Trade Project, Trevor Sutton. We together hosted about 10 workshops over the course of this year, where we were trying really to get from persons in the sustainability world their ideas, their proposals for how the trade system needs to get with it, get on board with this sustainability agenda. And represented through about 10 bullet points are our proposals for reform. I think you'll see that climate is one of the more important elements of that agenda because it's reflected in sort of the first 4 of our proposals for reform. But that agenda is wider than just environmental sustainability. It goes also to social sustainability and economic sustainability, which people associate much more with the trade system. How do we move the system to be more economically sustainable over the longer term? But I just want to mention maybe 3 or 4 of the uppermost ideas in our mind about how the WTO needs to become more green, both in terms of its substantive areas of focus, but also the processes through which these reforms are actually going to become effectuated. So the first proposal that we put forward in our Villars Framework speaks to highlighting that in the very DNA, in the preamble of the World Trade Organization's agreement, is a reference to sustainable development that many people have forgotten. And I would say even the negotiators at the outset have forgotten, because it talks about the world trade system actually being a pivot or a way of promoting sustainable development. And I think the way the ideology, the economic ideology behind trade has functioned is we think always about enhancing gains, welfare gains economically, less so how these are implemented and operationalized. How do we actually distribute the economic gains that you derive from greater access to markets? What the sustainable development agenda of today is requiring us to do is think about how we embed that in a people-centered, inclusive, and transparent process. And that's really what the Villars Framework is about. So you will see our first proposal is actually to highlight the sustainable development component of that preamble and actually work through the committees at the WTO to embed that idea of sustainability in the very work streams through which members of the WTO work on some of these issues. So our first proposal is that we should align the WTO, integrate the WTO into work that other organizations and other systems are doing to promote sustainability. And in our framework, we spell out, first of all, the nationally determined commitments that countries sign up to. How do we ensure that members think comprehensively about how to use trade obligations to advance their NDCs? But also, we ask there be a statement in our upcoming conference of ministers at the WTO to actually get members to recommit to their net emission targets in the Glasgow Climate Pact. So that's the first sort of scene setting. More substantively, we also propose that members through the WTO work stream address the fact that every country, and this is actually part of their Paris commitments, use their own national systems and priority to advance their climate objectives. What we would like is that the WTO, through these committees, use countries' diverse approaches to climate change reform and work that through in the way that the committees actually do their work. And we have a couple of areas that we think deserve attention. One is to bring to the WTO's attention the impact of certain countries' unilateral measures like the EU CBAM and have a discussion for a more multilateral approach to dealing with their climate problems. So the first of these is to come up with a measurement protocol for greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with traded goods. And this can start on a sectoral basis, that in the WTO committees, you begin talking about how different countries measure their greenhouse gas emissions and come up with an inclusive process, start with the steel sector or the aluminum sector, for how you actually measure these emissions, because each country does it differently. And more importantly, each country is going to promote its own unilateral way of doing that, and that is what leads to trade tensions. The second area that we want the WTO committees to look at is equivalence in trade climate policies. So in other words, if the EU is doing CBAM, the US is doing another type of system to curb emissions, how do they come together and discuss a common way of recognizing the effectiveness of each other's system for these climate emission policies? We also want to work with key partners and let the WTO become a convening space for the World Bank, the IMF, UNCTAD, and other such partners to discuss carbon pricing. Because common approaches to the social costs of carbon is important, again, to eviscerate some of the tensions that arise by countries approaching this differently. And really important for parts of the world like mine, the Caribbean or Africa, or other areas where we have developing countries that are not as far along either in the measurement or the frameworks that deal with these carbon emissions, is to ensure equity, ensure inclusiveness, ensure that even in the way we measure greenhouse gas emissions, that these countries actually get a stake in the process of developing the standards and the measurements, but also get the type of technical assistance that they need in order to upgrade their systems to participate and compete really in these systems. And I'm going to end with one more major part of our Villars framework. As I said, there are 10, which is this idea of a new approach to subsidies. We take issue with an approach to subsidy disciplining at the WTO that only looks at the trade distortiveness of a subsidy program. At the WTO, you are deemed to be inconsistent if you apply a subsidy that distorts trade. What we want to do is add to that. Add to that a component that would look at how sustainable enhancing is a subsidy. And that is really important because we want to encourage governments to promote sustainability enhancing outcomes through their subsidy programs, not just look at the trade effect, the trade distortiveness of the programs. And when we think about it in these terms, we can think immediately of certain categories of subsidies that are not sustainability enhancing. And these are fossil fuels. So the question is, how do we incentivize governments to repurpose fossil fuel subsidies that are harmful to the environment into renewable subsidies, into subsidies that actually enhance food security, enhance positive approaches to marine diversity and avoiding marine pollution. And we would like these repurposed subsidies or funds used to subsidies to do important things, including allowing countries like those in the global south to be able to transition again to the new green economy. I'm going to stop here and hand over to my co-author Dan to talk about other aspects of the Villars framework. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Let me introduce Dan. Dan is the Hillhouse Professor of Environmental Law and Policy at the Yale School of Environment and Yale Law School, and he's Director of the Center for Environmental Law and Policy at the university. He is currently on leave to the WTO, where he's working with the Director General and is a leader in developing the reform agenda. The Villars framework was not developed by the WTO, but Dan, could you tell me a little bit about where you think the trade system and why it's failed in these areas, where it needs to go, and how is the WTO reacting to the Villars report and coming up with ways to implement the recommendations in the report?
Ken, thank you, and thanks to the whole team at the Atlantic Council that made it possible for us to be here. And thank you, Ken, for your leadership on these issues going back many, many years. Including helping me to set up in the state of Connecticut the first in America green bank, which I continue to look at as a point of real accomplishment, so thank you. I want to step back just for a second and think about what we are doing all here, 100,000 of us, in Dubai this week. And the real story of this COP is the global stocktake, which suggests we are not on track to get emissions down by mid-century to net zero levels. There are a few countries that are close, none that are on a certain path to that, and most, even those that are bringing down emissions, are not bringing them down fast enough. So this requires all of us to ask a question. What's your theory of change? How do we move from a trajectory of rising emissions to one of falling emissions? And I think there's not that many options, especially options beyond those that are already under consideration. Of course, we need new ideas around finance for change. We need to find ways to engage private capital as well as public resources. We need companies to take on a greater sense of accountability and responsibility. We're hoping that investors, particularly the sustainability-minded investors, will help put pressure on companies to adhere to a sustainability-framed business model and bring their emissions down. But when you ask what else is there to do in the face of a picture that's not very good, I think the trade system looms large. And it represents a structure of rules for international commerce that can provide a mechanism for delivering at speed and scale the kind of technologies, projects, infrastructure, and frankly, good ideas and creative thinking that's going to be required around the world to bring emissions down. And I think we would recognize, and that's what the Villars Framework does, that there is an opportunity for the trade system to do more. And that was really the mission that we launched with, that Jean-Yves and Joel Trachtman and I, and now dozens of other thought leaders around the world came together with this sense that there was an opportunity to shift the trade system from where it is now to be one that really has, as Jean-Yves has told you, sustainable development at its core and doing more to drive companies to be sustainability minded. So I think our picture, Ken, to answer your question, was that there are not many places that you can really get a grip on the global economy and transform how companies operate. And the trade system represents an underattended opportunity in that regard.
Great, thank you very much. Our next speaker is James Mwangi. He's the founder of the Climate Action Platform Africa. James, can you tell us a little bit about what you think the impact of the trade system has been on the African environment and how it's affected Africa's ability to address climate change, and what you think needs to change in the system? I realize that's a question that could take an hour, but if you could do a quick summary of it, that would be great.
Well, a good chunk of, thank you, Ken, and thanks, Jean-Yves and Dan, for the amazing work of the Villars Framework. It's been a privilege to have contributed to that and been part of the discussion. Ken, very often when we talk about Africa, a lot of time is spent analyzing the dire current and historic state, and a little bit of time expressing a very vague, desirable future state. So I'll actually invert your question, spend more time on what could be, and then maybe we can contrast it with what is, and we can talk about the delta. And Dan really nailed the point here, which is the stock take is telling us that as a planet, we are not on track to hit even the most modest of our Paris goals. And that's not surprising because we have a trade system, which is what we use to allocate capital and activity around the world. We have a trade system that was optimized for a fossil fuel and emissions intensive world. It subsidizes the movement of hydrocarbons around. It allows and it concentrates production in places that don't necessarily have all of the factors of production. We move stuff to places to make it. And that becomes difficult in a world where we need to move from where energy was easy to move around in the form of highly energy-dense fossil fuels to one where energy is still abundant. The world has more, my continent alone, Africa alone, has 17 times global projected electricity demand in 2050. Falling on the, in the form of wind, solar, and hydro every year. So we're not short of available energy or the technologies to extract it. It's just really hard to move, right? Transmitting energy over long distances is difficult and so on. Now, that's the reason why we're falling behind on the stock take, is the system is inefficiently set up, so we move fossil fuels around to drive industry where it is. We're falling behind on another challenge, which is the SDGs. Billions of people are not being raised into dignified livelihoods and out of poverty fast enough because parts of the world are completely excluded from global value chains as currently designed. Again, my continent exports as close to zero value-added raw materials as you can possibly get, almost without exception, and imports virtually all of its high value-added goods. That is a formula for sustained poverty no matter how you slice it. People would look at these two things and say that those are two really complex problems. Gee, James, why are you dragging us to this second problem when we have enough trouble with how far behind we are on the stock take? Inherent and embedded in the points of the Villars Framework is there are actually two sides of the same coin. The degree of impoverishment and exclusion in places like Africa is the exact manifestation of the fact that we're choosing to leave 1.5 billion people out of the race to zero. And what form might that take? It might look at saying, there's three ways you can actually get to where we're going. One, you need to preserve the carbon sinks we have. Secondly, you need to decarbonize our industrial activity or all of our activities as rapidly as possible. And thirdly, you need to accept that we are behind the clock and you're going to need to remove a massive amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. All three of those things could be done at massive scale and limited trade-off in many parts of the global south. I usually say Africa, but this is actually true in many other places in the global south. What does that require? Firstly, we need the products and the products and tools to access that energy to flow more freely around the world. So improved access to renewable energy infrastructure. That just lowers the cost of energy, and other technologies of that kind. The second thing is we tend to focus a lot on energy supply. There's a lot of people here solving aspects of how to think about energy supply. We're not thinking enough about the future of energy demand. The vast majority of electricity using industry that will exist over the next 20 to 30 years as we electrify everything doesn't exist yet. And I would say we should put it where the electricity is, the potential electricity is massively abundant. That requires mechanisms like the CBAM, for example, to actually look at the real carbon intensity of imports coming in and recognize that iron ore converted into green steel in Africa and shipped to Europe as green steel is much preferred to shipping hydrogen and iron ore to Europe to be processed into green steel. And the same with aluminum and so on and so forth, right? That's on one end. Now, the other thing we need to recognize is there's a carbon economy that needs to come into existence that's not just about limiting what we're putting up or protecting our carbon sinks, but also incentivizing innovation in the removal of greenhouse gases from the atmosphere and the scaling up of that. One of the biggest arguments against technologies like direct air capture as a carbon dioxide removal technology is that it is so energy intensive that it would have to come at the expense of other decarbonization activity if we were to do it at scale, even if we were using renewable energy. One place where that is categorically and provably false, Africa. 17 times total global potential demand in untapped energy and plenty of room to capture and store carbon dioxide. So if you're going to build a 5 billion ton a year industry, where do you put it? In the place where it will make the most difference. So again, we look at, and what is the effect of things like the Inflation Reduction Act that is actually pulling all the innovation in direct air capture and so on to places like the oil belt in the United States, where actually it's the wrong industry to do there. If you have green energy there, for goodness sake, use it to retire fossil-powered energy. Right? Look for places where there is no alternative competing use of the renewable energy. So across all of these various frameworks, well-intended moves like the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, like the Inflation Reduction Act as currently written, by ignoring the global aspects of this, are forgetting the principal lesson of global trade. We didn't get into this mess of climate change by each acting as individual actors. We had the most integrated global system in human history. We're going to require an equally integrated one on the way out that rewards climate positive growth. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Our last speaker is John Morton. He's the Managing Director and Head of Americas for the Pollination Group. John, extraction of resources, unsustainable forestry, unsustainable land use, unsustainable agriculture, pollution, have all had a significant impact on natural resources, including pushing species towards extinction, affecting biodiversity. And trade, of course, plays a major role in the reasons for all of these activities taking place. Can you talk a little bit about trade's impact on natural resources and what really needs to be done to help ensure that we move away from an unsustainable use of natural resources to a sustainable use that takes into account climate change and biodiversity?
Thanks very much, Ken, and thanks to the Atlantic Council for hosting. It's a big challenge to go after all three speakers, including most notably James. Let me just say a couple things at the front. COPs are interesting. I tend to think that panels fall into three categories: big new announcements, self-congratulatory blather, and new thought leadership, and important thought leadership. And I would put this paper and the thinking behind it in that last category. And it's a real pleasure to be part of a group that is leading with thinking and that is necessary and timely and needed if we're to truly grapple with the challenge that we all know we are confronting. And let me just state the obvious, because I think the way this paper was presented, it is perhaps it's perhaps missing one important framing. The paper isn't asking the trade system to do anything other than what it was created to do, right? That's important to say. What we currently have is a trade system that is fundamentally misaligned with the fair, equitable, and efficient allocation of resources, right? The commonly agreed social cost of carbon, if you include the externalities associated with it, be they human health, be they environmental, human health, et cetera, is around $200 a ton. Now you can quibble with that number, whether it's 70, 150, 200, or 250, but let's pretend for a moment that that price was actually embedded in the global trade system, as most economists think it should be, right? You would have a fundamentally different trade system than the one we have today, right? We don't have that pricing system in our international system, and therefore we have the distortions that have led to the massive, continuing, and dangerous depletion of natural resources, biodiversity, and of course exacerbating the climate crisis. So what I think this paper is highlighting is the need for almost a return and a recommitment to the efficient allocation of resources, which is based upon carbon, nature, its value to the global economy being appropriately priced. And a lot of these fundamental subsidies and misallocations would get taken care of if that price existed. Now, I'm not an idealist. I'm a realist. I've served 9 years in the U.S. government under the Obama and Biden administration. I know that a carbon tax is an impossibility for the U.S. in its current form. And therefore, the question is, how does the global trade system and how does the WTO begin to pick up the slack and take some of the responsibility, frankly, for the misalignment of policy that we see across jurisdictions? And I think we are asking, in that sense, this paper is asking the WTO to step in and play a role that is different from the one, and to step forward a bit and to demonstrate leadership in ways that it perhaps goes beyond the comfort zone of the system itself. Yeah, and that is a fundamental, I think, premise of the paper. Let me say a couple other things. With respect to nature and biodiversity, the Pollination Group that I work at is a global advisory and investment firm advising corporates and governments and financial institutions on net zero and climate transition strategies. We believe that the transition to a low carbon and net zero and nature positive future is not just an essential transition, but one that represents a tremendous economic benefit to human society if done right, well, and expeditiously. And so I think as we think about the readjustment in global trade that has occurred to reset and reorient the WTO around its original objectives of the efficient allocation of capital, I think we also need to understand that in doing that, we will be harnessing and triggering economic growth in a much more productive and advantageous way for communities around the world that have been left out of the current economy. So I just want to say I applaud the initiative. I encourage you folks to continue pushing this significantly in the months and years ahead, because it's an agenda that will take time to move, but this is a significant piece of thought leadership. Thank you.
Dan, in response to what John just said, what do you see as the next steps that the WTO and the World Trade System in general need to take to begin to implement these recommendations and to begin to start putting them into effect?
So Ken, as you know, and I'm sure there are others in the room know, we're gathered here for the annual COP meeting, which is the climate change annual negotiating session. The WTO has a not quite so regular structure of meetings every 2 or 3 years, a ministerial conference. It happens that the next of those is going to be in February, just across the country in Abu Dhabi. So the Emirates are in high profile over the course of a 12-month period, leading 2 of the most important gatherings in the world. And I do think there is a big hope that the progress here in Dubai at COP28 will flow into, and this is the answer to your question, Ken, a trade system gathering that takes up some of the opportunities provided and accepts some of the challenges. And in particular, the agenda that Jean-Yves laid out, I would like to see reflected in what the trade ministers agree upon when they're together in Abu Dhabi in February. So just quickly to reiterate, number one, recommitment to sustainable development as the direction of the system. Trade liberalization, economic integration is a means, not an end. The end is sustainable development. Number two, an explicit recognition of the need for alignment between the trade system and the governments who make up the trade system who have commitments to climate change action. It happens that 164 members of the WTO have all committed to the Paris Climate Change Agreement of 2015, the Glasgow Climate Pact of 2021, and thus to net zero emissions by mid-century. The trade system needs to be managed in a way that enhances the ability of those nations to fulfill their nationally determined contributions to climate action. Number three is the opportunity, as almost every speaker has suggested, to really lay a framework out that allows countries to work together. Common standards, common approaches, equivalence across divergent policy strategies, but a way to minimize the trade risk from divergent policies in other domains. And number four, huge opportunity, really rethink subsidies as a way to drive the incentives for business to operate in a more sustainable fashion going forward. Now, not all of that can be fully agreed upon in Abu Dhabi in February, but all of it could be laid out as a work plan where it can't be agreed upon fully. And the WTO could be mandated to take up these issues and process them over the next year or two, with the hope that negotiations in a further round, 2025-26, pulls that into a package. And it's our hope, and this is answering John's kind of comment, it's our hope with this project that you might actually get a sustainability package of agreements on which countries would come together in 2025 or 26. It seems to me that new framing around sustainability is something there's a lot of interest in, and it would potentially provide a way to rejuvenate the trade system, reinvigorate it, and perhaps broaden its political appeal in the many places there where it's now in some disrepute.
Jenny?
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks to all the speakers. There's one element, I think, of the program and the framework that we've missed here, and I don't want to lose the opportunity to put it front and center. John, I'm going to take a little issue with your opening comment that the way the system was designed itself is not imperfect. And I think what we have seen, especially now with the sustainable and inclusive agenda, is a focus, one, on states and mass aggregation of wealth that the WTO has not addressed fulsomely has been a mistake. And I think each country, even the larger ones, if you look even at US policy now, the pivot towards worker-centered rights, disadvantaged groups, indigenous communities, women, small and micro, medium-sized enterprises has been completely ignored up to now. I think what the SDGs provides is an opportunity to recommit to a people-centered trade system. And I think we can't assume that the system is going to take care of these groups. I'll give you an example of why it's so important to move from the macro discussions, which I think we're still doing to a large extent in these type of forums, to the micro. A lot of the places where we have raw materials, critical minerals necessary to undergird the energy transition are where we have these dispossessed, marginalized communities. If we speak in the way we've been speaking for the past 30 years, we're going to ignore the fact that moving just towards comparative advantage of states and not thinking of how the trade system caters to these groups and communities by getting their input at the level of even the policies that we are driving is a huge mistake. Let's think also about this new approach to scope emissions and targets and literally measuring the carbon footprint at all levels of the global value chain. This is an issue for small enterprises who, one, can't even properly facilitate the management of measuring their carbon because they don't, one, understand what the demands are, but two, they're not being assisted by our current system. And a huge part of our Villars Framework, which James is familiar with because he was one of our top, actually, participants, is to think and embed in the very fabric of the trade system a thought about how this is impacting those communities, those companies. And so this is why part of our framework also looks at, as I mentioned before, redirecting again resources to these countries and communities that want to be and can be part of the value chain. They have something to offer. They do also have to meet the needs of the global transition. And I think one of the things we look at in the framework is how do we incentivize finance? This is a huge issue that we haven't even mentioned. The major issue for the Global South is finance and investment into the Global South in order to exploit, and nobody likes to use these words, but in order to sustainably harvest and invest in these renewable sectors. How are we getting, for smaller countries like mine, finance into areas that are still seen by the banking infrastructure, and that is the MDBs as well as private investors, very unattractive places because the risk and the rates of return when you do the balancing are not favorable. So this is why the Villars, we situate ourselves alongside the broader-based reforms of the international infrastructure for finance as part of how we move forward. Because if we don't think about how to bring the Global South by bringing resources there, incentivizing investors to come, by giving them reasons to come, but also ensuring the technology that they need so that the Global South itself can innovate and do what James is saying, which is make these countries the fulcrum of the low carbon economy. And I think we need to be much more holistic than assuming that the trade system as it was configured will take care of that. We need to be more intentional, and parts of the Villars Framework are very much about thinking about communities, Global South communities, and marginalized groups. So I wanted to make sure that that point was underscored. I don't want it to be left out of the conversation. Thank you.
John, did you want to say something?
I think it's very well said. I agree. This goes well beyond. My comments were specifically around the kind of the distortionary impacts of the lack of a carbon price, which does not address in any way, shape, or form the broader points, frankly, 5 through 10, or 4 through 10 in the paper, which John Eves has very eloquently addressed right there. So totally agree.
Can I just jump in on that and say to John, please look for the op-ed piece that came out yesterday by Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, with Kristina Georgieva, with Ursula von der Leyen, with all of these leaders of the important institutions that frame our global economic governance, saying together what you've said, which is we need to have a carbon pricing framework that gives us a starting point for understanding how to take seriously the different approaches to climate change. And the fact that we have a framework doesn't mean everyone's doing the same thing with a carbon price explicitly, but we do need to recognize there's a value to a global social cost of carbon as the backdrop to the structure of response that we need to see across the world.
Ken, you invited my comments. I'll be very brief. I think we're beginning to see, and I think it was referenced before, the carbon border adjustment mechanisms, beginning to see forms of policy response, which to my mind are important signals that we are looking for ways of ensuring that carbon leakage is not allowed. Yeah? We need at the same time very proactively, and I think this report suggests this in at least the front end of the recommendations, to think of ways that we not just look to tariff bad behavior, but we look to incentivize good behavior. And that's an important part of this paper as well. Our trade policy, very, very at a very high level, is not aligned with our national climate policies. And that is the key piece. It starts with carbon pricing in some way, shape, or form, but certainly is not limited to that. And I'm optimistic about how this paper fits into the broader direction of travel that we're beginning to see in the policy and regulatory frame.
Yeah, if I may come in, I think one of the things I'll pick up on, John, you talked about some of the political challenges within the US to getting towards the right outcome. I think there's a mirror image set of challenges in developing countries where I think a lot of our policy architecture is still anchored in a development equals increased emissions kind of orientation, which means that a lot of the engagement of developing countries, if we're to realize this vision, needs to move away from saying, well, these new pressures to decarbonize are something we should be asked to be excused from, but actually say, well, no, we want these restrictions or these barriers, these measures applied fairly, equally, and consistently in ways that actually play for the mass majority of people in developing countries to their competitive and comparative advantage. So it's not about asking for a special dispensation necessarily. There are places where that is certainly morally justified, but we're actually just saying if the playing field were truly level and if we did things oriented towards the continued survival of the planet, that cannot help but increase these countries' competitiveness and their ability to grow their economies and address poverty.
Well, thank you. I want to thank all of the panelists. We unfortunately only have a minute or two left, so I'd just like to leave people with a thought and what they might think about after this is over. If I had more time, I would have spent a lot of time talking about how we go from the macro to the micro on each of these issues. And take an issue, for example, on environmental justice and equity. It's easy. Everybody agrees we should have equity and justice, but there's a lot of inertia in the system. How do we actually take steps that ensure that that happens? How do we ensure, for example, that finance, you might be able to get an interest rate in the United States now on a project at 5%, and in many countries in the world, it might be 10 or 15%. That doesn't promote equity. What are the micro steps we have to take in achieving environmental justice, in achieving the balance of nature and the protection of nature that we need to do to protect our environment, and again, in the whole trade system, what are the different steps that need to be taken? There's a lot of that in the Villars report, but it's a start, and people have to think about it and they have to work at it. And I personally look forward to seeing how the Villars report goes forward, how the World Trade Organization works on it, what additional steps, and the additional work being done by everybody on this panel. So thank you all very much. Thank you, everybody.